Hello everyone and welcome back to the Skyrim audio adventure. I'd just like to say before we begin that I was very pleased with the response that I saw to the last video, because whenever you take a long period off like that, it's encouraging to see the audience just, come back and still show interest after you've been gone dealing with life for a while. And before we proceed, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to my amazing patrons. Welcome back, Eric Upchurch, and welcome two new patrons, Ryan Abrahamson and Clyde Booth. It's great to have you. Thank you so much for supporting the show. One of these days, I'm going to have to film the little happy dance that I do whenever I get a new patron, but I don't know. The internet's got enough cringe on it already, but then again, that's never stopped me in the past. And without further ado, let's get into Chapter 12 of the Skyrim audio adventure, The Dead Forest. Necromancer. What a devastating word. Few things in the world are more constant than death. That constancy can sound like a threat to some, a comfort to others, and to a select few ambitious and unscrupulous mages, it sounds like a challenge. They are the ones who turn away from the natural laws, twisting the very concept of life and death to meet their ends, no matter the transgressions, no matter the cruelty, no matter the cost. For most with a fundamental understanding of history, the archetypical necromancers were Potema, the Wolf Queen of Solitude, and Manimarco, the King of Worms. Bloodthirsty, power-hungry, and dreadful, at their peaks they commanded legions upon legions of undead. They had only been stopped by the interventions of legendary heroes and stalwart commanders. As such, the hunter couldn't help but wonder, what in all oblivion were the two raggedy bowmen still doing there? Once they had squeezed a few more details out of Anise and asked her to get word back to Riverwood, the pair had continued towards the falls. Tucked into a dense cluster of trees, they now camped on the unfamiliar shore of a familiar lake. They could hear Lake Ilinalta rolling away beyond the light of their modest fire. The stars slowly wheeled overhead. The moons danced somewhere beyond the mountains tonight. If the moon's light had graced the lake this night, they would not see a well-trodden bank with easy access to a main road. This was the western shore. The only paths out here were left by critters, hermits, and intrepid hunters like themselves. The hunter lay out the bedroll he'd bought with the money from the boar. It was a welcome luxury. Since he'd lost his camp, he'd been crawling inside his backpack like a bear trying to fit in a gopher hole. This was a marked improvement. He bit into some dried pork and caught the pear that Bracknell tossed to him. "Something wrong with your hand?" Bracknell asked casually. "You seemed pretty eager to get that thing off tonight." The hunter examined the stump closely and rubbed it with the tip of the middle finger on the same hand. He resisted the urge to stick it in his mouth and gnaw on it. "Yeah, ever since we talked to Anise, it's been burning and stinging like you wouldn't believe." "Sounds like an infection, or at least a blister. The night air will do it some good. Just stop picking at it for kind's sake." Yeah. The hunter gave an exaggerated nod that did little to hide his agitation. He could feel the hypertension pull at the back of his head. "So what's the plan? Snatch a couple of slaughterfish for the road and head back?" Bracknell stilled while preparing some wildflower tea in a small kettle, and fixed him with a piercing gray-blue eye. "There's no running from this, boy." "I disagree. I think this is the perfect time to run from this. We haven't committed to anything. We haven't gotten its attention. We could turn back right now." "And then what?" "I don't know. Run to the garrison or the Whiterun Guard." "Oh, and tell them that a petty sorcerer is gathering power in the Bleak Falls Mountains. As if they've got time for that. The war is moving. There's word that the Stormcloaks are going to attack the fort at Bloodlet Throne. How on Nern can you know that? Because I keep my ears open, you get? That's insane. Why would they do that? Even if they took the fort, they'd be stuck between the garrison at Helgen and the border guard at the Pale Pass. You speak with imperial rationality. You fail to acknowledge the Nordic taste for glory, intimidation, and symbolic victories. They could take the fort and abandon it the next day, and their ends would have been met. Fine. If we can't get the garrison to move on it, then we go to the guard. You mean the guards who are already spread so thin they only have 2 men in Riverwood? Gods be damned, at least they signed up for this kind of thing. I didn't. Alright? Listen. The old Nord leaned forward, the contours in his wizened face flashing in the flickering firelight like the stony visage of a mountain god in a lightning storm. Necromancers, soulbenders, commanders of corpses, however you want to say it. They are a sickness on the land, and like every sickness, they start out small. What you need to ask yourself is how many creatures, critters, and good honest folk will need to be hurt, or killed, or worse, before the powers that be are affected enough to do anything about this. The hunter glared back at his friend. He knew there was only one real answer. Too many, he said. How long before the Jarl puts an underwhelming bounty on this fellow's head? The hunter scowled and took a bite of the pear. Too long. It's not an easy thing knowing. You can try to forget, but you often won't. And the knowledge that you could have stopped something terrible cuts deeper than any blade. That's why you must act. Even if you didn't ask to know. Even if you're scared. You can't guarantee that anyone else will do something. You can only count on yourself. The hunter stared pensively into the fire. He finished his pear and buried the seeds. Do you think Anise will actually get back to Riverwood? She seemed earnest enough to me. She also seemed pretty sedentary. So am I until something moves me, and yet here I am. Nothing about that whole conversation seemed strange to you? Not particularly. Should it? I don't know. The hunter pulled off his boots and stuffed his legs into his bedroll. I've got history with mysterious women living in the woods. I know you do. The hunter snatched some charcoal from the fire and crushed it in his hands. Have you ever tangled with a mage before? Bracknell began to settle himself in for the night as well. I've spent a lot of time with mages. Back in the Legion we had this special group called Battle Mages. Those people were a force of nature. Just one of them on your side could sway the tide of battle. Yeah, but besides drinking tea and sharing camp with them, did you ever actually fight against them? Bracknell poured himself some tea and passed some to the hunter. I've survived a few run-ins with little wizards and witches. Apprentices, though. Too green to be quick with anything practical. I've also had moments where I could do nothing, even if I wanted to. The hunter chewed some charcoal and washed his mouth out. When was that? The elder hunter's eyes grew far away. A word of advice. If you ever meet a Thalmor calling themselves a justiciar, pray. That's the most you can do. The tiny light of an ember popped into the air and drifted off towards the lake. The hunter watched it as it went. How in oblivion are we supposed to match wills with a necromancer? I never even understood magic, let alone cast a spell. Ah, yes, Bracknell said, sipping his tea. Well, magic comes from the stars, being windows to Aetherius and all. I'm sorry, what was that? Magic comes from the stars. The hunter thought back to a discussion they'd had in the Bannered Mare. How do you know about magic? I thought you hated mages. When did I say that? When Ayala tried to get you to take that ice sword to the court wizard? Oh, that's not a matter of like or dislike. That's a matter of trust. Mages, especially the high and lofty mages like that, are notorious for pissing about with shite they shouldn't. You remember the Great Collapse of Winterhold? I heard something about it, yeah, back when I was a kid. Well, half the bloody shitty is in the Sea of Ghosts because of the mages at the college. And the people never even got an explanation. Homes lost, trade in shambles, loved ones dead, not a word from the college. So no, I don't trust them. But it doesn't mean that I hate them, and it certainly doesn't mean that I know nothing about magic or Aetherius. The hunter took a deep breath and sipped his own tea. Okay, well, magic, gods, stars. Where should we begin? Bracknell wiped some sweat off his neck and sighed. Do you know about the wheel? The hunter shrugged. I know about wheels, but I don't think that's what you're talking about. Here, I'll say it as best as I remember. It's an old Church of the Nine Divines thing. The old Nord pulled an arrow from his quiver and used the point to draw in the dirt between them. He drew a circle within a circle connected by 8 lines. It wasn't hard for the hunter to spot the aforementioned wheel, complete with spokes. Here we have Mundus, or creation as we know it, said Bracknell, gesturing to the center of the circle with the fletching. And out here is Aetherius. He pointed to the outer circle. The realm of magic and the creator gods, Magnus, Shor, and others I can't recall. What of the spokes? The spokes are the Daedra that bind our world to the realm of Aetherius. We represent them both as divines and the other planets. Wait. The hunter choked on some tea. The gods are planets? The old Nord waved away the question. The moons are a god's corpse and the gods are planets. Trust me, that isn't the half of it. Now, give me a moment. I need to remember their names. He screwed up his face in visible effort. Let's see. By the intercession of Saint Alicia, you may be so filled with grace and strength and wisdom that comes from grace, that through these teachings you may come to the true meaning of the 9 divines and their glories. To convey, and that's where I lose it, hang on, all the she's and the skies out of the parchment. I'll skip a bit. Basically, Akatosh gave us 10 commands. He continued to strain as he counted on his fingers. There's Stendar, who says, be kind and generous to the people of Tamriel, protect the weak, heal the sick, and give to the needy. Second is Arche, who says, honor the earth, its creatures, and the spirits living and dead. Guard and tend the boundaries of the mortal world, and do not profane the spirits of the dead. Then we have Mother Mara, who says, live soberly and peacefully, honor your parents, and preserve the peace and security of home and family. Fourth comes Zenithar, who says, work hard and you will be rewarded, spend wisely and you will be comfortable, never steal or you will be punished. Next comes Talos, man turned god as worthy as all the rest. He says, be strong for war, be bold against enemies and evil, and defend the peoples of Tamriel. Kynareth, riding the evening breeze, says, use nature's gifts wisely, respect her power and fear her fury. Then there's Dibella, who says, open your heart to the noble secrets of art and love. Treasure the gifts of friendship, seek joy and inspiration in the mysteries of love. And boy, have I ever. Penultimately, we have Julianos, who says, know the truth, observe the law, when in doubt seek wisdom from the wise. And finally, Akatosh. He says, serve and obey your emperor, study the covenants, worship the 9, do your duty, and heed the commands of the saints and priests. The 10th command, delivered to mortal ears and hearts from the heavens, comes from the 9 altogether. They say, above all else, be good to each other. The old Nord finished and looked to the hunter with a bright smile. Wow, said the hunter, genuinely impressed. How did you remember all that? You get that drilled into you when you're away and in the church. I can't hope to live up to half of that, and I'll probably forget most of it by morning.
Well, that's the great thing about ideals and aspirations. Even if you fail to live up to them, there's nothing stopping you from aspiring again.
That's nice, the hunter remarked. We're living up to an ideal right now, I suppose.
That we are.
Here's a question. The hunter leaned forward and pointed to the circle. There are 9 divines, and yet here there are 8 spokes. Why is that?
There are 8 other planets, each represented by a divine.
Bracknell pointed to each of the spokes in turn.
Stendar, Arche, Mara, Zenithar, Kinnereth, Debella, Julianos, and the chief Akatosh.
So where's Talos?
Talos came later. Tibra Septim ascended to godhood and became Talos. There, Talos represents us.
He pointed to the center circle.
Nern. He is our representative among the 9, and we are his representatives among the planets.
By the mountains, the hunter swore softly. So where does that leave Oblivion and the Daedra? What about Aela's friend? Bracknell took a long, loud sip of his tea.
Well, the Daedra are everything the Aedra are not. Malicious, vengeful, and sadistic. But to their credit, they are certainly more present, and a heck of a lot more willing to intervene with mortals. I've never met one myself, but from what I've heard in stories, some Daedra are more harmless than others. Hircines always seemed on the more tame side.
Turning people into werewolves is on the tame side?
One of Molag Bal's pseudonyms is the Lord of Rape. So yes, werewolves are pretty damn tame.
The hunter threw up a hand as a sign of contrition, and downed the rest of his tea in one gulp. Okay, so on this wheel, where's Oblivion?
On the wheel, Oblivion is the space between the spokes. But like I said, that's a simplification, and this all goes much deeper. Too deep to get into here, so let's try to get back on track. We were talking about magic, right?
Right. The hunter shook himself back to the reality that they had a mage to reckon with. So, you said the stars are portals to Aetherius, so the magic is being siphoned through the stars from the god realm.
Sort of.
What do you mean, sort of?
Remember what I said about this not translating well? You're going to need to get used to the idea that I'm just representing this as best I can.
So I just need to get used to contradiction?
Welcome to religion.
Bracknell chuckled.
When you say magic is siphoned, it makes it sound like mages are just wandering down to the magic creek, collecting some magic energy for their daily magic baths. Each of our souls is a piece of energy from Aetherius, and they carry the connection to Aetherius itself. Those with the ability to strengthen that connection and use the energy of Aetherius within and around themselves as it leaks into our world are called mages.
Can you do any magic?
Me? No, not a jot.
The hunter just about threw his cup into the fire. Then how am I supposed to listen to you talk about the fundamental principles of magic? You can't even cast a spell. You're just as clueless as I am.
I'm not clueless,
Bracknell said, sounding genuinely offended.
You knew almost nothing of what we discussed. I've spent plenty of time learning this. I've just never had the aptitude. I had a battle mage friend, and she was hell-bent on teaching me how to create sparks of flame with a snap of my fingers. It was the most rudimentary of all fire spells, and it's pretty practical to boot. But did I ever create so much as an ember?
I wanna say no.
Not one. And I went above and beyond. Induced many a hallucination trying to find that deeper connection between my soul and Aetherius, but none of it did any good.
He tipped his cup back and finished his own tea.
Had a hell of a time, though.
I'm sure you did. The hunter sighed, pinching his brow. How does any of this help us for tomorrow? We're going against a necromancer. How do we do that if we're both magically blind?
Well, I think the key is this. The necromancer uses their magic to puppet corpses. Now, I'm not sure if he's subjugating the souls or using his own magic to simulate the souls, but in either case I think we can remove the bulk of the problem by removing the necromancer.
I see. The necromancer is the puppet master. If we cut the strings, the marionettes aren't an issue.
And if we're going to die trying, it's in our best interest to take that bastard with us.
Yeah, I suppose there's that.
Either way, the necromancer should be the focus.
And not the horde.
No, we shouldn't need to clear out the whole forest.
Just one man.
Aye, just one man.
The hunter ran his hands down his face and reached for his short sword. He pulled it partly from its sheath and saw the dying embers of their campfire play off the shine of the steel blade. Did you bring anything in case they get close?
Aye, this time I did.
Bracknell reached over to his pack and held up a sizable single-sided steel axe.
This and change. I knew what we might be walking into. The question is, do you?
I think I've got some idea now.
Not what I meant.
The hunter met Bracknell's intense gaze once more.
Stranger, you're probably going to have to kill someone,
he said gravely.
Are you ready for that?
The hunter didn't say anything at first. He wanted to say something but didn't know what to say. He turned away and tucked himself into his bedroll. He heard Bracknell do the same. The fire had gone dark and the pair lay in star-speckled blackness by the time he finally found the right words. I've got your back, if you've got mine. They didn't bother rising early the next day. Not that there wasn't reason to. Perhaps they were both trying to buy more time, whether to prepare or just in general. They rose slowly, breakfasted heartily, and packed silently. Once they had filled their water skins at the lake and no more quiet excuses could be made, they began the long hike up the mountain. The first order of business was to find the inlet that fed Lake Elenalta and start following it uphill. When they found the inlet, the hunter wasn't sure whether to classify it as a modest river or an overzealous creek. Whatever it was, it led them winding up mossy hillsides, over huge protruding roots, and between stoical boulders. At one point, the hunter looked back to see the scintillating water of the lake beneath the ancient sun. It had taken them less than half a day to match the height of Helgen. He thought he could just make out the mighty stone walls distinct against the mountainside in the distance. Then he turned back to the ascent, gulping some much-needed breaths as he did. Where they were going, the air would be getting thinner. The woods grew dark, not in shadow but in bark. Black trees, brown leaves, still growing and sprouting against all natural logic. He had seen more trees in his time in this forest than could ever be counted. He knew deep down in the moat of his reason what a tree should look like. He may not have had the botanical education to articulate it, but he knew. The trees he saw here were wrong. They were green where they should have been brown, and brown where they should have been green, thin where they should have been overgrown, and vice versa. There was black ooze leaking from wounds that gaped and roiled like infected flesh. Mistletoe and witches' brooms permeated not only the canopy, but the ground and roots over which they stepped. The hunter felt a crawling rot reaching for his breath, but he shook it off and pressed up the mountain, breath shallow. The first words of the day were said when the pair rounded a grove of cedar and found themselves in a damp glen housing what was less of a waterfall and more a particularly steep incline with a rush running down to a pool. "Is this it?" the hunter asked.
"Aye, this is it,"
panted Bracknell, leaning on a tree trunk. "I was expecting more falling water for a waterfall."
"Well, it's not called Great Falls or Grand Falls or clearly distinct from the Rapid Falls. It's called Bleak Falls, isn't it?"
"I get that, but I must say I was expecting a bit more than this. Just a trickle of incontinent piss wandering down the leg of the world." "Sure as bones, you're in a mood, aren't you?" "Yeah, well, I'm trying to get it out of my system before I die."
"Blast, keep that shite to yourself. I don't need it on my shoulders."
As the pair bickered, a most curious thing happened. A wandering cloud chose that moment to dip low over the glen. The hunter tasted the moisture in the air before he noticed the fog tightening around them like a noose. "Hang on," he said, holding up a hand, interrupting their discussion as to whether it had been a river or a creek. The only thing that they had decided to that point was that it was definitely not a brook. A brook was out of the question. "What's going on?" Bracknell looked around, unimpressed.
"Just a cloud bank. It'll pass."
"No." The hunter's eyes swept his disappearing surroundings with growing agitation. "It won't. Do you feel any wind? 'Cause I don't." Bracknell rolled his tongue around his teeth as he took in the strange phenomenon.
"Perhaps you have a point there."
The fog thickened to an opaque wall and just stopped, holding resolute, neither waxing nor waning, not moving nor lifting. Many laymen would have hardly noticed the difference, but to the hunter, he could think of little else than when they had visited Dragon's Reach, and those giant doors had slammed shut behind him. "And niece said it was near the falls, so we should be close."
"That's true. We can't just go walking up the falls, so that means we either go left or go right."
"Did you get a look in either direction?"
"No, you were blathering on about the bloody falls."
"Yeah. So which way do we go?"
"Do you have a coin?"
"A coin? No, I don't. Money makes noise. I left it with Delphine."
"Ah, just means you don't know how to store it."
The old Nord reached for a spot behind his own ear and pulled out a single silver coin.
"Heads we go right, tails we go left."
"Where did you have that?" the hunter asked, quirking his head. Without answering, the Nord tossed the coin with a flick of his thumb, caught it, and flipped it.
"Heads." Again. "Okay, right it is."
The hunter looked at the coin, then to the right of the falls. "Huh." Bracknell followed his gaze.
"What? You see something?"
"No. It's just that I never see Nordic silver coins these days."
"Ah, well, this is my lucky coin."
"I hope you're right." The hunter sighed and readied his bow, notching an arrow and holding it between his middle and ring fingers on his augmented hand. The pair stepped carefully, re-entering the bizarre labyrinth of trees. The hunter didn't know why, but some part of him had expected the shadow to somehow help with the fog, as if it was the comparative brightness of the glen that made the pale mist so impenetrable. Alas, he was wrong. This gloom proved just as bewildering. Every tree was indistinguishable from the last. At some point, the hunter just started counting every soft, tentative step. He knew that it was probably fruitless, but it was the closest to navigation he could manage. At about the 232nd step, by his count, he dropped to one knee for a breath. Bracknell did the same, just off his hip. He looked at the old Nord with wide eyes. "This is insanity. We could be right in the middle of their camp right now and not know it."
"Sounds like a damn docile necromancer, then. Trust me, we would know it."
"This is like we're just waiting to step into a bear trap."
"Maybe. Or not."
Bracknell's eyes had wandered past the hunter. He placed a hand on his shoulder and pointed.
"Look there. Do you see that light?"
Strangely enough, the hunter did see a light. It was an unnatural blue flicker, so pale it was barely distinguishable in the fog. It looked maybe 30 feet away from them, but it was hard to tell, given that the ground became obscured at 10 feet. "It's like a little candle."
"Aye, a blue one."
"No way that's natural."
"Aye, but the unnatural is precisely what we're looking for. Come on."
The hunter would have protested, but the old Nord was already moving, and if he got too far away, he'd lose the coot in the fog. So, he swallowed some curses and followed. They had only gone a few yards when the hunter realized that the light wasn't getting any closer. Then, when the hunter reached out to stop Bracknell, the light simply vanished.
"Blast, where's it gone?"
Bracknell peered about. Something tripped the hunter's alarm. That innate sense we have when someone is standing near us. He whipped his head about and saw nothing but motionless mist.
"This isn't good, old hound,"
he said in a voice barely above a whisper.
"No, it's fine. I can see it. It's over there now."
"Bracknell!" The hunter pleaded, but away his friend went once more, and he had to follow. His ears, nose, and skin. 100 alarms were screaming in his head. The low branches of the trees looked like wicked fingers, and the fog seemed to be rising up beneath them now, each step causing ripples in the miasma like they stepped through water. Movement suddenly flashed before the hunter's face, and he looked with a start. It was an iridescent, blue butterfly. He watched in silent amazement as it orbited his head twice before alighting on his chest.
"Damn it, it's gone again. Give me a moment."
"No, no, no," the hunter breathed as he looked down at the butterfly. "We need to go." He started to scan their surroundings. The ripples they were making in the fog were no longer alone. Like two tides meeting on the sea, he could see dozens of other waves rolling towards them from out beyond the fog. Suddenly, a new wisp of light flared up ahead of him.
"Ah, there it is,"
Bracknell growled and started moving away to the left. With a lightning-quick motion, the hunter reached out and snagged the old man's collar, rudely yanking him back. Bracknell choked and spat as he was brought face to face with the hunter.
"What in oblivion are you playing at?"
"Just stop for a moment, you daft fucking git!"
All right. What's got your knickers in a twist?"
"Do you see that light right there?" The hunter pointed ahead of him to the new light. Bracknell followed his gaze.
"What? No, the light's over there,"
he said, motioning left. "Well, I'm seeing it right there. We're being separated. What's more, we're already surrounded. They're all around us." Bracknell looked around again.
"No one's here."
The hunter gritted his teeth and hissed. "Stop looking with your eyes." The elder hunter's brow furrowed at his companion's tone, but he listened. The hunter saw his eyes unfocus for a moment, tuning into his other senses, then watched as all the hairs on his neck stood on end. When Bracknell's gaze refocused, all he had to say was a bashful, "Oh." The hunter's relief was short-lived. As stale, stationary air filled his lungs, he felt a windless chill caress his neck. The forest had been deathly silent just a moment ago, but now, a gentle rattle caused his ear to twitch. It was a soft vibration just below a sound, like walking past a dark house and knowing it was not empty. Something shifted just below the surface of his senses. He looked out to the periphery of their visual space. The ripples in the fog were coming stronger. The hunter felt his adrenaline reaching a fevered pitch. His mind threatened to slip away as his body was piloted by instincts. Werewolves were not the only ones with the beast sleeping in their bones. Everyone dances a waltz with their animal selves, and his animal self was scared. Head down, tail between his knees, terrified. Halfway to shitting himself just so he'd be carrying less weight when the time came to bolt. He'd been scared all day. He'd have been scared since they'd set out on this venture. Only now did he really admit to it. Legs driven by fear, he backed up into a tree, like a mouse seeking shelter from a hawk. As he rested his back against it, it gave away as empty space. His feet slipped out from under him, and his surprised yelp echoed weirdly off the other trees as he fell down, tumbling ass over ears, down, into the dark. He came to a stop mercifully quickly, though it wouldn't help the gray hairs he was sure he now had. He might have been more frightened if he hadn't spent the last 10 years living in a forest, but he was able to comprehend his situation pretty quickly. The faint smell of charcoal and must only confirmed it. He had tripped down into the hollow of a burned-out tree. It was lucky that his bow had been in his hand, otherwise it may have snapped. As he took several calming breaths, Bracknell slid down to him feet first.
"Are you hurt?"
Nowhere that matters."
Good. Come on, let's get you up.
The hunter felt the gnarled hand grip his arm and pull him upright. He saw the pale mist of the outside world, a dim forest made bright by the contrast of the shadow he now sat in. Once on his feet, he did a quick assessment. Nothing lost, nothing broken, just a few superficial scrapes. Wordlessly, the pair climbed up the short slope of the hollow and back into the forest. As his head crested the entrance, the hunter registered a change. The faint sense had built into a distant tapestry of whispers. Voices too quiet to be audible, but too numerous to be missed. He found his friend's eyes and saw that he was listening too. He gripped the Nord's shoulder. "We're turning around. Back the way we came."
"Aye,"
Bracknell muttered.
"I think you're right."
A voice stood out in sharp contrast to the building cacophony. "Are you hearing this?" the hunter asked in a hushed tone.
"I am,"
said Bracknell, scanning around.
"Sounds like we've got ourselves a damned rude host."
The hunter looked for the butterfly on his chest, hoping he hadn't crushed it when he fell. It was gone, and he looked around for it for a moment until, with an azure twinkle, it alighted on his right shoulder. When his eyes rested on it, something moved beyond, and he froze, like the skittish animal he felt he was. Floating in the mist, some unknowable distance away, was a face, a pale, melancholic visage of a woman. He tapped Bracknell and pointed. The old Nord followed his gaze and suppressed a gasp. The longer they looked, they began to make out her form standing next to a distant tree. Hood pulled back so wisps of ghostly hair waved around an angular face. Robes hanging in tatters blew in some unfelt wind. The hunter felt assaulted, as if struck in the chest with a deep, profound sense of loneliness.
"You must stay. You will be safe in the mist. No one will find you."
"Oh, no way we're staying," the hunter muttered. Bracknell smacked his shoulder.
"Best not respond to it."
Right. It's about 380 paces back that way. Then we can listen for the falls."
"I counted more like 400.
Bracknell said as they scrambled out of the hollow and began to backtrack. "Good to know," came the voice, a clear whisper and soft breath on the back of his neck. He didn't respond this time. He didn't even think of a response. Everything looked different walking this way. But the hunter was sure that his years in the woods would not fail him. His mind was focused. They needed to leave. And so, stumbling over tree roots as they went, they left. The hunter checked his person again when they got back to the falls, but there was no sign of the butterfly. The dainty apparition, it seemed, was gone for the moment. The fog was still as heavy and immovable as always, but in comparison to what it had been in the Forest of Wisps, it was as clear as drinking water. Speaking of which, the first thing the pair did was sit down on large stones by the pool and take several long pulls from their water skins. They drank nearly half their water supply right there, stress and uncertainty making them parched men. The clear, nearly glacial ripples of the falls lapped gently against the modest bank. The pair looked to it, then at their depleted water skins, then to each other.
"Nah,"
Bracknell shook his head.
"Best not with a necromancer around. Who knows what that water would do to you?"
"My thoughts exactly," agreed the hunter and took another drink.
"Listen, stranger,
Bracknell scratched his mane of hair bashfully.
I'd appreciate it if you could not mention any of that to Aella. It wasn't my finest showing.
The hunter shook his head dismissively. Don't worry about it. Worry about that, he said, pointing across the way. The old Nord turned with him.
What?
There's only one way to go now.
I'm surprised that you don't just want to head back.
Well, as I see it, if we can see it and touch it, we can kill it. Back there? The hunter jabbed over his shoulder with his thumb. That wasn't even fair. If we see the same thing going this way, then we can rethink this whole approach.
Works for me. Steward of the mountain.
Hey, don't get me wrong, I just don't like walking a long way for nothing.
Sure. Who does?
Bracknell waved his hand to hide a smile. Did any part of that make sense to you?
Back there?
The elder hunter scratched his thinning shock of hair.
Well, I never thought I'd run into anything like that, but the old stories of Wisp Mothers or the Pale Ladies spring to mind, don't you think?
Wisp Mothers? Maybe, but that didn't line up with any of the accounts I've heard. You felt how many there were, and you heard her voice.
Aye, the Hollow Ones wait for us.
Was that a threat, you think?
Sounds more like a warning to me. Means we're on the right track.
How do you figure?
Well, think about it. Hollow Ones? What better way to describe the undead progeny of a necromancer?
The hunter wobbled his head from side to side in a motion that was neither a nod nor a shake. I suppose. Like marionettes. He shrugged off his pack and pulled out his boar tusk to continue carving. Do necromancers see through the eyes of their creations, or are they autonomous? Bracknell scratched his neck.
Couldn't tell you. I wouldn't be surprised by either scenario.
But you're sure that killing the necromancer will fell his minions? Even the automatons?
He's animated dead flesh and shaped it to his will. Once that will is gone, the body should go back to being dead.
And until then, we attempt to kill the dead.
Aye, that about sums it up.
The elder hunter pulled a carrot from his pack and tried to bite into it. He failed, frowned, and started rubbing the vegetable between his hands. The hunter quirked an eyebrow at this, but didn't comment. Instead, he looked back to his carving, turning it slowly, and mused. How did I get here? I remember it all, but it's like it doesn't tie together correctly. We went fishing, I got attacked by vampires, I met warriors of legend, I talked with a werewolf, now I'm hunting a necromancer? Where's my camp? Where are my books? Where's Velod and Ingrid and young Hamming?
Your world is expanding. Nothing is ever going to make complete sense.
It's not just that, it's this. Wolves run like mice, elk live in fear of fire, birds drop from the sky as the forest grows sick. Some unknowable eldritch putrefaction, like a decay turned predatory. And me, walking into it. Or, away from it? He screwed his eyes shut, and his mind pulled at some tangled thread. What about the fish? How do the salmon factor into this? Bracknell continued to massage the carrot, and cast his eyes around the glen as if the answer was carved into the black bark of the trees.
Necromancers have been known to use a large array of toxic alchemical agents in their work.
So that got into the water supply and killed the salmon?
It could have.
The hunter spoke slowly as if trying to convince himself of something. So, this flow here is where that toxin is leaking in.
Well, look around you. I'd say this is the source.
So the water we got from the lake is just as toxic?
The lake water is pretty diluted. Fed from several sources, runoff from these peaks and even from the throat of the world.
That makes sense, the hunter said, but his voice betrayed that it was more of a question than a statement. Bracknell's bushy eyebrows were getting lower and lower.
Yes, it does. doesn't it?
So the salmon are in the bays and oceans and come upriver to the lake. And the hissed carp breed in the lake and get carried down the river, but never make it past all the salmon. We should be fine because the water is heavily diluted and we're bigger than the salmon anyway. But the hissed carp are smaller and they seem to be fine, and so are the slaughterfish, which are bigger than the salmon and live mostly in the lake. Size isn't the determining factor here. The old Nord blinked.
We're missing something, aren't we?
We must be.
And by the Jarl's warty bum, what is wrong with my hand? Ah!
The hunter suddenly cursed loudly and started shaking out his right arm emphatically. He pulled his false finger off and stuck the stump in his mouth.
Easy, quiet down. You must have given yourself leather burn.
The half-breed hunter held the now moist nub up for examination. Ah, look at it. No rash, no blister, no nothing.
A phantom pain,
Bracknell commented soberly.
I've known soldiers who've lost limbs and experienced the same thing.
He took a successful bite of the carrot and waved the remaining length around for emphasis.
Do your best to relax your hand.
Ah, yeah, sure. Relax my sword hand on my way to murder someone.
Just to do your best. All this other stuff we can sort out later. None of it will matter once the necromancer's dead.
Fine, the hunter said, allowing himself a few more curses as he strapped the finger back on. Let's get this over with. The pair stowed their snacks and accessories and got underway once more. The hunter tried to take a few deep, calming breaths, but no relief could be found in this close, sickly air. He buried his face in his hands and tried to rub the cobwebs off of his mind. He felt Bracknell's hand on his shoulder.
Are you sure you're okay? You don't need to head back?
The hunter brought his hands away from his tired eyes. How can I, after seeing all this? He spotted a trail of conveniently placed stones leading across the water, but he couldn't see the opposite bank.
You think we could make it across right here? I think so, assuming they go all the way. And the damn things don't move. They seem steady enough, though.
The Nord looked at him again, really starting to worry now.
Stranger?
Stream! The hunter spun around with the brightest smile he'd worn in days, virtually hopping with sudden joy. Bracknell blinked.
What?
It's not a creek, it's not a river, it's absolutely not a brook. Because it's a stream.
Kind's breath, you're right.
Bracknell slapped his forehead.
It's a bloody stream.
Cracked it! The hunter leapt onto the first stone with childlike gusto. At least we cracked one mystery. The day is looking up, Bracknell. He called as he skipped across.
Too right.
The Nord chuckled to himself as he followed. Luckily for the pair, the path of stones did indeed span the width of the stream, and soon they were back on dry land and winding up into the trees to the left of the falls. The fog persisted here, strange and unmoving as ever. The hunter thought he could hear birds fluttering overhead, but he could not see them. He didn't know if they were flying to or from something, and frankly, he wasn't sure which to hope for. He pressed forward. The black mold bleeding from the trees smelled like rotting eggs. He pressed forward. What he took for a dried-out fern ahead of him jumped up and skittered away on spindly legs. He pressed forward. They had gotten just about as far as they had gone the other way, when the hunter spotted a familiar blue glow dancing in the gloom. Oh, come on. He sighed in exasperation. Bracknell, you seeing that wisp too?
That I am.
The hunter stroked his chin. Hypothetically, if we do turn back now, how would we change our approach?
I think it's getting closer.
Would you consider asking a mage for help?
Stranger, look out!
A lesser man would have turned around slowly and dumbly to watch as death took him. The hunter didn't need to look. He simply took his friend at his word and dove away to the side. He heard the swoosh and thud of a swinging weapon being buried in the ground where he'd stood but moments before. He spun on a knee and saw two blue glowing orbs looming towards him as they sat inside a hollow, skinless human skull. A skeleton, picked nearly clean, rotted sinew between the joints and ribs, wisps of hair still clinging to the blackened patches of scalp. No muscles bid it motion, no organs bid it life. Only the blue lights burning from those lidless sockets told that this was anything other than a long, decayed cadaver. Its bony features were enigmatic, but the massive greatsword held in its segmented hands made its intentions quite clear. As it hauled the sword up over its head for another strike, the hunter, realizing the sword was too long for him to get out of range, instead scooted forward, bridging off his hands and stomping the aberration's kneecap. As his boot made contact, he felt it pass through an unseen layer of something, as if he was stepping into mud. However, it only held for a moment. Next thing, the patella was crashing through the back of the joint, and the whole leg shattered. He barely had time to be pleased with the effectiveness of his attack before he noticed the sword falling towards him as gravity brought the whole horrid thing down on him. Dropping onto his back, he intercepted the thing's arms and guided the sword away from him. When the skeleton landed on him, he half expected it to be as heavy as a man, but fortunately, it was not. With a swift shift of his hips, he rolled the thing over and drew his dagger. Looking at the hollow ribcage, he saw nothing to stab. In his moment of hesitation, the aberration grabbed onto his wrist. He winced. It had no mass, but didn't lack for cold, unnatural strength. It raised its sword in one hand and tried to cleave him in two. Remembering his numerous wrestling matches with Ayala, sanctioned and otherwise, he took advantage of the thing's hold on him and rolled sideways, flipping it face down and lining his hips up to its elbow. He leaned back on the arm bar, feeling that musky miasma pushing back for a moment, but soon he heard the cracking and popping and felt the arm come free. He tossed it aside and raised his dagger, not to stab, but to smash. He drove the hilt into the thing's bare skull again and again. As it cracked, he saw the lights in the eyes flicker. The jaw dropped open in a silent approximation of a scream. He fit the point of his blade into the crack and pressed until it caved like an eggshell. The bone split apart, the dagger sunk into the dirt, the lights fizzled out, and the skeleton went still. As the hunter stood, wiping sweat off his brow, he scanned around the fog. Nothing else seemed to be coming. Bracknell stepped over to him and patted his shoulder. "You handled that pretty well, I'd say." "There is no way. They're all going to be that easy." The hunter stood still, scanning. "Certainly not. I was expecting there to be more of them." "What if the others are fresher? What if they're stronger?" "Aye, strength is one thing, but remember, anything that can carry a blade is dangerous. We need to keep our heads on a swivel." "What if it has multiple swords? Then it's extra dangerous." "Multiple swords? I suppose that would be a hazard." "Divine save us if we run into an undead octopus with swords." "An octopus?" Yeah, with 8 swords." "Are you trying to make a joke?" The hunter might have had an answer ready, but instead he just bent over and retched a slurry of water, apple, and jerky onto the forest floor. "Oh," Bracknell said sheepishly, and rubbed the younger man's back as he heaved. "I figured this might happen, but really? Over a skeleton?" "It felt wrong." "It felt wrong," the hunter said hoarsely, pausing to spray snot and spittle from his nostrils. "Killing it, just touching it, it felt wrong." "Well, yes," was all Bracknell could manage at first. "Try to look at the bright side." The hunter spat and glanced up. "That being?" "At least we know we're going the right way." Thank you for listening to this episode of the Skyrim audio adventure. I'd like to thank my friends Brenda and David for helping me out by providing some ghostly voices. If you yourself would like to lend your voice to this show, then reach out to me on Discord. It's also a great place to stay up to date on my channel. We're only getting closer to that necromancer and things are about to ramp up big time. And so I hope to see you then on the next episode of the Skyrim audio adventure. Happy New Year to you all, and once again, thanks for listening.